Welcome to the podcast to preserve, protect, and defend the soul of America.
We're really thrilled to have you here with us today.
I am Alex, by the way.
And I am Sam.
The topic we shall discuss in today's show is the American adoption system, power, family, and the search for origins.
It is a really, a really intense subject for us to get into.
It really is. Today, you are exploring the massive gap between the idealized version of adoption, which is, providing loving homes for children, and the complex historical reality where institutions have frequently imposed their own definitions of a worthy family.
Right, and when you look closely at that history, you often find those definitions are reflecting the interests of the powerful over the vulnerable.
Exactly. I mean, imagine, just for a second, discovering in your late 50s that the mother you were always told abandoned you. Well, she actually spent decades trying to find you.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Or imagine learning that her signature, the actual document giving you up, was obtained while she was heavily sedated in a hospital bed.
And literally denied the chance to even look at your face. It's harrowing.
It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel. But for countless families, it is simply history. So, in our deep dive today, we are going to explore the subtitle of our source material, which is, well, it covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, the subtitle really lays out the whole journey for you.
It does. It is the baby scoop era, international adoption's rise and collapse, transracial adoption's contested ethics, and the search for origins in the DNA age.
That is a lot to unpack, but it's so important because, usually when we hear the word adoption, our brains immediately go to this purely benevolent, beautiful act.
Right. It's framed as this absolute, unquestionable good.
Exactly. But as we dig into the text today, what emerges is not some single unified system built just on altruism.
No, not at all.
It's actually this huge, sometimes really chaotic collision of legal frameworks, private agencies, religious institutions, and honestly, massive market forces.
Yeah, huge market forces. And there is this persistent struggle between the genuine human desire to care for children and these entrenched institutional ideologies that dictate exactly how that care should be delivered.
And to whom it should be delivered, right?
Right. So to really understand how that gap formed between the ideal and the reality, we have to start with a specific legal precedent. We have to go all the way back to 1851.
1851, okay, Massachusetts.
Yes, Massachusetts passed the very first modern adoption statute in the world, and it established a principle that sounds completely obvious to you and me sitting here today. It declared that adoption should be governed by the best interests of the child.
Which, that was incredibly revolutionary for the mid-19th century.
Wait, really? It wasn't the standard before that?
Not at all. Prior to that 1851 law, legal arrangements involving children in America were almost entirely about the convenience and, the economic needs of adults.
Oh, like apprenticeships and things like that.
Exactly. Apprenticeships, indentured servitude. It was a way to secure farm labor or to ensure an inheritance stayed in a specific family line. Children were essentially viewed as property or economic assets.
Wow. So legally mandating that a judge has to consider the child's welfare first? That was a massive paradigm shift.
A total shift. But the fascinating and honestly often tragic reality of the next century and a half is the story of how institutions actually interpreted those best interests.
Because who gets to define what is best for a child?
Exactly. That gap between the noble ideal of 1851 and what institutions did in practice sets the stage for the first major crisis we're looking at today, which is the baby scoop era.
Right, the baby scoop era. That runs roughly from the end of World War II in 1945 up until 1973.
And the sheer scale of it is just staggering. We are talking about an estimated 1.5 million American women surrendering their infants.
1.5 million. That is just a massive number.
It really is. And to understand how that happened, you kind of have to put yourself in the shoes of an unmarried pregnant woman in 1945. What were her actual options?
Well, looking at the history, she could marry the father, assuming he was even willing. She could risk her life and her freedom seeking out an illegal abortion.
Right.
Or she could try to keep the child, which in the 40s and 50s meant facing near certain poverty, a total lack of employment, and basically complete social exile.
It was a deeply unforgiving society for that.
It was. Or her last option, she could surrender the baby. But the bizarre thing here is that by the 1950s, Surrender wasn't just presented as an option on a menu. It was culturally and institutionally framed as the absolute only moral choice.
Which is wild.
It is. How did society suddenly justify treating unmarried mothers as if they were fundamentally incapable of raising their own children? Feels like a total psychological trap.
Well, it was a trap. It comes down to a very specific ideological shift in the psychiatric and social work fields at the time.
Okay, break that down for us.
So, following World War II, there was this intense cultural insistence on the nuclear family. The two-parent heterosexual married household was viewed as the ultimate bulwark against communism and social decay.
The whole Cold War mentality playing into family structure.
Exactly. It was seen as the only legitimate place to raise a child. If a child was outside that structure, they were viewed as inherently deprived. And to enforce this, the medical community essentially pathologized unmarried motherhood.
Pathologized it.
Right.
Like, meaning they treated it as an actual disease.
Exactly like a psychiatric disorder. The text highlights a highly influential book published in 1954 by a psychoanalyst named Leontine Young. It was called Out of Wedlock.
Out of wedlock.
Yeah. And she and her contemporaries argued that an out-of-wedlock pregnancy was almost never an accident. Instead, they framed it as an unconscious, neurotic acting out of pathological impulses.
Wait, so they blame the pregnancy on a subconscious neurosis?
Yes. The logic was literally the very fact that you got pregnant outside of marriage is undeniable proof of a deep psychological disorder.
Wow.
Therefore, you are, by definition, unfit to be a mother.
That is just a terrifying, self-fulfilling diagnostic trap. The diagnosis itself contains the verdict. You are pregnant and unmarried, which proves you are mentally unwell, which means the only cure is for us to take the baby away.
It's circular logic at its most destructive,
Yeah.
and you have to look at how perfectly that medicalized framing served the institutions.
Right, because it lets them off the hook for the real issues.
Exactly. By turning what was essentially a socioeconomic problem, things like poverty, lack of access to contraception, employment discrimination against women, into a medical or psychological problem, society didn't have to fix the structural issues.
They just treated the patient.
Right. Social workers genuinely believed they were treating a neurotic patient by removing the burden of the child. It gave them this therapeutic rationale to apply immense pressure.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that pressure, because looking at the source material, it wasn't just a polite suggestion. It was incredibly blunt coercion.
Blunt.
Many of these women were sent away to maternity homes to hide the pregnancy. These were often run by organizations like the Salvation Army or Catholic Charities.
And inside these homes, they were systematically stripped of their identities.
Yeah, they were given pseudonyms, right?
Yes, fake names. They were actively discouraged from bonding with their babies or even forming friendships with the other women in the home.
Just total isolation.
And they were relentlessly counseled by authority figures, clergy, social workers, doctors, that keeping the child was a deeply selfish act.
So the entire environment was engineered to break down their resistance.
Completely engineered for that. And when it came time to actually deliver the baby in the hospital, the practices crossed the line from heavy social pressure to overt physical coercion.
This part is so hard to read.
It really is. There are thousands of testimonies from women who were explicitly denied the opportunity to see or hold their newborns.
Because the medical theory at the time was that visual or physical contact would weaken a woman's resolve to surrender.
Yes. And then there's the sedation. Women recount being heavily medicated, sometimes given drugs that induced a twilight sleep. And this was often without their informed consent during labor.
And then, while they are still in that altered, heavily sedated, deeply vulnerable state, a social worker would literally walk into the hospital room, place a pen in their hand, and get their signature on relinquishment papers.
Sometimes within hours of giving birth.
That is just completely unethical. Furthermore, many were verbally assured these signatures were just temporary. They were told they could change their minds once they got back on their feet.
Which was a total lie.
A complete lie. They would find out later that the surrender was immediately irrevocable.
And the mechanism that truly sealed the trauma of this era, the thing that locked it away from public scrutiny, was the legal apparatus that followed the surrender, the sealed records system.
Ah, yes. The sealed records.
By the 1950s, almost every single state in the U.S. passed laws completely sealing original birth certificates the very moment an adoption was finalized.
Right, they would issue an amended birth certificate that literally listed the adoptive parents as the child's parents from the moment of birth.
Just absolute erasure.
It erased the biological, cultural, and medical identity of the child in order to present this new adoptive unit to the world as a quote-unquote natural family.
And the justification for this shifted over time. Back in the early 1900s, proponents claimed it was to protect the child from the public stigma of illegitimacy.
But by the baby scoop era, that rationale had completely morphed.
Yeah, it became about protecting the adoptive family from any potential interference. And supposedly it was to allow the birth mother to go home, pretend nothing ever happened, and resume a normal life.
But you can't just mandate that someone forget they gave birth. That's absurd.
No, you can't.
What it actually accomplished was a profound dislocation for everyone involved. I mean, adoptees grew up completely cut off from their own medical history. No knowledge of hereditary conditions whatsoever.
Which is a huge health risk.
Huge. And a total lack of what psychologists call a mirrored identity.
Oh, explain that concept for the listener.
Yeah, mirrored identity is just that simple, grounding, everyday experience of looking at a relative and seeing your own nose or your own mannerisms reflected back at you. When you are adopted in a closed system, you never have that.
Right, you're just untethered. But the culture insisted that an adoptive family was exactly identical to a biological one in every single way.
So therefore, any desire from the adoptee to know where they came from was seen as pathological.
Exactly. It was seen as ungrateful or neurotic. But, you cannot suppress human nature forever. Eventually, there was massive pushback.
And that brings us to 1976. An organization called CUB Concerned United Birth Parents was formed.
This was such a watershed moment.
It really was, because women finally started speaking out publicly about the coercion they had endured. It shattered the polished professional narrative that these had been voluntary healing surrenders.
The psychological literature that emerged in the 80s and 90s studying these women was just devastating. It revealed that they suffered from prolonged, complicated grief.
So they hadn't forgotten, as the social workers promised they would.
Not at all. They experienced intense anniversary reactions every single year on the child's birthday. And they showed significantly higher rates of psychological distress than both adoptive parents and the adoptees themselves.
It took decades of relentless activism to start cracking open those sealed records. Oregon was actually the first state to do it via a citizen ballot initiative with Measure 58, and that was in 1998.
Which finally allowed adult adoptees access to their own original birth certificate.
And you know what? It proved that giving adults access to the factual records of their own existence didn't cause the sky to fall.
Imagine that.
Right. But the immense institutional resistance they faced, it highlights a core paradox in our deep dive today. The entire system was built around the desires, comforts, and anxieties of adults.
Adoptive parents wanting security, institutions wanting finality.
Exactly, while entirely subordinating the fundamental civil rights of the adoptees themselves.
And if we look at the timeline, the end of the baby scoop era didn't happen because the institutions suddenly grew a conscience.
No, it was largely hastened by the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade in 1973, along with the growing cultural acceptance of single motherhood.
Right. By providing a legal alternative to forced surrender, the domestic supply of adoptable white infants plummeted almost overnight.
But this creates a huge issue. What happens when that domestic supply suddenly drops, yet the cultural demand from childless couples remains incredibly high?
Well, you look elsewhere. That drop in domestic supply directly caused American institutions and prospective parents to pivot globally.
Which ushers in the next major phase of our discussion, the dramatic rise and eventual collapse of international adoption.
And it really starts in the aftermath of war. In 1955, an Oregon farmer named Harry Holt saw a documentary about mixed-race Korean children.
These were the offspring of Korean women and American servicemen, right?
Yes. And these children were heavily marginalized. They were essentially outcasts in post-war Korea. So Holt and his wife ended up adopting 8 of these children.
8 children.
Yeah, and his actions established a very durable template for international adoption. It was this powerful fusion of genuine humanitarian rescue, religious mission, and American exceptionalism.
That template became incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
And it was largely immune to critique because it was framed purely through the lens of saving children.
Right, because if you're saving a child, who's going to argue with that?
Exactly. Very few people were asking the structural questions. No one was asking, could we support these children's mothers and communities directly in Korea rather than exporting the children across the globe to America?
And this model became so entrenched that South Korea eventually turned into one of the world's largest per capita exporters of children for decades, even long after it had rebuilt into a highly prosperous modern nation.
It just became an industry. Then as we move into the late 80s and 90s, the collapse of the Soviet Union triggers the next massive boom.
Oh, Romania.
Yes. For anyone old enough to remember, the images broadcast from Romanian orphanages in 1989, right after the fall of the dictator Nicolas Ceausescu, they were absolutely horrific.
Just heartbreaking.
Children in unheated, barren rooms, severely malnourished, literally tied to cribs. The Western response was immediate, a massive rush of families wanting to adopt and save these children.
But Romania became the tragic paradigm for what happens when you combine a genuine humanitarian crisis in the global south with a sudden, massive influx of Western wealth and intense emotional desire.
It creates an unregulated market.
Exactly. And markets operating on human beings without rigorous legal oversight inevitably produce corruption. The rush to adopt quickly devolved into widespread fraud. You had middlemen literally going to rural villages and offering struggling parents money for their children just to meet the foreign demand.
That is horrifying. Which brings us to an even larger demographic shift covered in the text, China. China opened its doors to international adoption in 1992 and rapidly became the largest source of foreign adoptees to the United States. And this is where the moral complexity becomes incredibly dense for a prospective parent.
It really does.
How does a system distinguish between a genuine humanitarian rescue from an overcrowded orphanage and acting as a pressure valve for a coercive state policy? Because we are talking about China's one-child policy, which literally forced families to abandon their daughters.
The intersection of state coercion and deeply entrenched cultural reality in China during that period is profoundly disturbing.
Can you elaborate on that cultural reality?
Yeah, so you had the strict implementation of the one-child policy in 1980 colliding with a centuries-old cultural preference for sons.
Right.
And the state penalties for having an unauthorized second child were draconian. We are talking about forced sterilizations, massive financial fines that could completely ruin a family, and the loss of employment.
So they basically had no choice.
Families in rural areas were trapped. They faced immense economic pressures where sons were the only social safety net expected to support aging parents. So families were essentially forced by their government to abandon female infants.
And it's crucial for you as the listener to understand how these abandonments happened, because they weren't just tossing children into the wilderness.
No, not at all.
Families often left these girls in highly public places, train stations, busy markets, the steps of government buildings, specifically so the child would be found quickly and cared for by the state.
These weren't necessarily uncaring parents. They were families backed into an impossible, devastating corner.
Yeah. And American families adopting these girls were responding to a real crisis in under-resourced Chinese orphanages, providing deeply loving homes. But at the macro level, the international adoption system allowed the Chinese government to quietly offload the human cost of its totalitarian policy onto foreign families.
It commodified the children. And this commodification is what built the architecture of fraud.
Let's talk about the economics of that architecture.
Well, when you look at the economics, the fees for a single international adoption could easily run between $30,000 and $50,000.
That is a staggering amount of money,
Yeah.
especially in developing nations.
Exactly. When you introduce that kind of money into impoverished regions, you create a massive self-interested momentum.
So walk us through how that money actually moved, because it didn't just disappear into administrative overhead, right?
Not at all. It flowed to very specific actors who had a vested interest in keeping the supply of children high.
Right.
In-country facilitators or brokers were paid per child. Orphanage directors received mandatory donations from adoptive parents for every single placement. Agency staff back in the U.S. earned salaries and bonuses based on volume.
And the adoptive parents themselves, who had invested their life savings and immense emotional energy, well, they were often highly reluctant to ask too many pointed questions about how exactly their new child became legally available.
You can see how the system basically blinded itself. This financial incentive structure led to devastating abuses, and Guatemala is a prime example of this.
Oh, Guatemala. The text really digs into this. In Guatemala, the adoption system wasn't run by a centralized child welfare agency. It was entirely privatized and run by Notarios local notary publics.
And the statistics alone are wild.
Yeah, Guatemala is a country of about 13 million people, but it was at one point placing more children for international adoption than China. a country of over 1 billion.
which is a statistical impossibility. It was a glaring red flag for systemic corruption. The notarios were acting as brokers, heavily incentivized by Western money. Children were obtained through the blunt coercion of marginalized birth mothers, the falsification of abandonment documents, and in some documented cases, outright kidnapping from hospitals or streets.
It's just evil. And we saw similar systemic fraud in Ethiopia. The HIV/AIDS epidemic there created a very real orphan crisis, sure, but the influx of Western adoption money led to the creation of something called the paper orphan.
The mechanics of the paper orphan are incredibly insidious.
How did that work?
Local recruiters or brokers would go into remote rural villages. They would find families living in extreme poverty and offer them a total lie. They would tell the parents, let us take your child to the city or to America for a boarding school education. They will get a degree and come back to help the village.
Oh, so the parents think they're sending their child to school.
Yes. The parents, just wanting a better life for their child, would agree. But the broker would then take the child to an orphanage, forge a death certificate for the parents, or forge abandonment papers.
Effectively turning a child with a loving, living family into a legally adoptable orphan.
Exactly. And the American parents on the other side were told the child was destitute and completely alone.
It is heartbreaking. Research later showed that the majority of Ethiopian children classified as orphans for international adoption actually had living parents who never consented to a permanent loss of their parental rights.
It's just devastating.
The fallout from these global exposés of trafficking and child buying in Cambodia, Vietnam, Guatemala, Ethiopia, it eventually led to a massive collapse in the system. By 2019, international adoptions to the U.S. had plummeted by nearly 90%.
90%.
Yeah. Source countries shut down their programs out of national shame or to stop the bleeding, and receiving countries implemented much stricter rules under the Hague Adoption Convention.
But to truly understand why American demand was so intensely high in the 2000s, especially in places like Ethiopia, we have to look beyond just a general desire for children.
Right. There are other forces at play.
We have to look at the specific cultural and religious forces driving it. This brings us to the evangelical adoption movement.
Yes, the theology of rescue. In the mid-2000s, you had highly influential figures in the evangelical church, like theologian Russell Moore.
He published a book called Adopted for Life, right?
Exactly. And he framed adoption not just as a nice thing to do, but as a core theological imperative.
Yeah.
The argument was that because Christians believe they are spiritually adopted by God, physical, earthly adoption is a direct reflection of that divine transaction.
And it was incredibly effective messaging. It mobilized tens of thousands of American evangelical families. Adoption basically became a visible mark of Christian virtue.
Huge organizations hosted massive conferences, and individual churches built entire ministries around this specific call to address what they termed the global orphan crisis.
But let's pause and look critically at the data they were using to mobilize people, because the entire movement was anchored by a staggering statistic frequently cited from UNICEF: 147 million orphans worldwide.
Right, and hearing that number, you'd naturally think there were 147 million children living on the streets or in institutions desperately needing extraction.
But wait, how does an orphan statistic actually get calculated? Because my understanding from the source material is that this number was catastrophically misinterpreted.
It is a textbook example of good intentions operating on completely misunderstood data. UNICEF defined an orphan, for statistical purposes, as a child who had lost one or both parents.
Oh, just one parent.
Yes. The vast, overwhelming majority of those 147 million children were living with a surviving parent, or with grandparents, aunts, and uncles in their extended family networks.
They were not without family.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were grieving, and they were often in need of material support, clean water, or educational resources, but they were not in need of extraction to a new continent.
But the evangelical movement, operating on the assumption that 147 million children were totally alone, created an enormous demand for adoptable children, and that demand fed directly into the illicit market dynamics we just discussed.
Right. It inadvertently fueled what critics called child laundering. Theologian David Smolin is a very prominent voice here.
Yeah, his story is intense.
He and his wife, motivated by their faith, adopted 2 girls from India. But once the girls learned enough English, they told their new American parents that they had actually been stolen from a loving mother who desperately wanted them back.
Imagine hearing that from your newly adopted child.
Smolin became a vocal critic of this movement from the inside. He, alongside journalists like Catherine Joyce, who wrote The Child Catchers, highlighted how this rescue theology poured millions of dollars into a system that agencies were financially incentivized to keep running, even if it meant looking the other way on fraud.
And while all of this global extraction was happening, there was a simultaneous shift happening in domestic adoptions within the U.S., a move toward open adoption.
Right, because research was finally catching up to reality, showing that open adoption, where birth and adoptive families maintain some level of ongoing contact, it significantly lowered the long-term grief for birth mothers and helped adoptees form clearer, healthier identities.
But while the culture shifted toward openness, the legal framework did not. The reality of open adoption in America today is fraught with severe legal vulnerability for the birth parents.
Explain how that works, because I think a lot of people, including myself before reading this, assume an open adoption agreement is a binding contract.
In most American states, it is not. Open adoption agreements are essentially moral agreements. They are not legally enforceable contracts.
Wow.
Yeah. When a birth parent signs the relinquishment papers, their parental rights are legally terminated. Full stop.
So if the adoptive family later decides they're uncomfortable with the arrangement?
If they move across the country, change their phone numbers, and completely sever contact, the birth parent has absolutely no legal recourse to enforce the original agreement. They enter the arrangement from a position of radical legal vulnerability.
It is a profound systemic imbalance of power. And when we talk about the extraction of children and systemic power imbalances, we must recognize that this dynamic wasn't just an international phenomenon. It was deployed domestically as a deliberate weapon of assimilation against Native American communities.
The history leading up to the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 is a very dark chapter of American history.
It really is.
For over a century, the official policy of the United States government toward Native American communities was forced assimilation.
It was literally encapsulated by Richard Henry Pratt. He was the founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and his infamous motto for the boarding school system was, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man."
Horrific.
Tens of thousands of Native children were forcibly removed from their reservations, transported hundreds of miles away to these military-style schools, and brutally punished for speaking their indigenous languages, practicing their religions, or even wearing traditional clothing.
And the intergenerational trauma transmitted by that boarding school system is incalculable. Entire communities were stripped of a generation of children.
Yeah.
And as that boarding school system began to decline and close down in the 1950s, it was simply replaced by a new mechanism of removal, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Indian Adoption Project.
So the mechanism changed, but the goal was the same.
Exactly. The overarching goal was still assimilation, but now it was executed through the wholesale transfer of Native children into non-Native foster and adoptive homes.
And the criteria social workers used to justify removing these children were often based on profound cultural ignorance.
What do you mean by that?
Well, white social workers would go onto reservations and observe Native extended family structures, where grandparents, aunts, uncles, and community members shared the child-rearing responsibilities communally.
Okay, a very different model of care.
Yes, but the social workers, applying a strict white nuclear family standard, would misinterpret that communal care as neglect or abandonment.
So, by the mid-1970s, the statistics were apocalyptic for tribes. Between 25 and 35% of all Native children in the United States had been removed from their families.
That is over a quarter of all their children.
And the vast majority of them were placed in non-Native homes. It was quite literally an existential threat to the future survival of the tribes.
In response to this crisis, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, in 1978. It completely changed the landscape by establishing a strict placement hierarchy.
Which mandated what, exactly?
It mandated that if a Native child had to be removed from their home, preference must be given first to their extended family, then to other members of the child's tribe, and then to other Native families. Placing the child in a non-Native home was meant to be the absolute last resort.
Crucially, ICWA recognized a unique legal principle, that Native tribes have a collective sovereign interest in their children that exists independently from individual parental rights. The child is viewed as a citizen of a sovereign nation.
But ICWA has faced intense, heavily funded legal challenges, culminating most recently in the 2023 Supreme Court case, Elan v. Brackeen.
This is a huge case.
It is. And to really understand the stakes, we need to look impartially at both sides of this deeply contested legal battle. On one side, you have a coalition of conservative legal organizations, several Republican-governed states, and non-native adoptive parents.
What is their primary argument?
Their primary constitutional argument is that ICWA's placement preferences violate the Equal Protection Clause.
Right. They argue that mandating a child be placed with a native family over a non-native family is a form of racial discrimination. Proponents of this view argue that child welfare decisions should be completely colorblind.
So they think it should be based entirely on the individual circumstances of the prospective adoptive parents.
Yes, and that placing a child based on their racial background is unconstitutional.
Okay, but on the other side, the defense of ICWA rests on a foundational principle of federal Indian law that goes back to the founding of the country. The concept that Indian is a political category, not a racial one.
Exactly. Tribes are federally recognized as sovereign political entities. They have a nation-to-nation relationship with the United States government.
So defenders of ICWA argue that legislation regarding tribal members is based on political citizenship, just as you would treat a citizen of France or Japan, not on race.
But the anti-ICWA coalition pushes back on this, arguing that the political distinction is functionally an illusion because tribal membership relies so heavily on blood quantum and biological ancestry.
It's a very complex legal web. In 2023, the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the law in a 7-2 decision, but they did so on standing grounds.
Meaning they didn't actually settle the core issue?
Right. They ruled that the non-native plaintiffs hadn't demonstrated sufficient legal injury to raise the equal protection challenge against the federal government. So they essentially left the core constitutional question whether the law violates equal protection open for future litigation in state courts.
What this intense legal debate clarifies is that adoption policy for Native children simply cannot be divorced from the historical context. You cannot separate it from the history of land theft, forced assimilation, and intergenerational trauma.
Supporters of ICWA argue that treating these foster care cases as isolated, individual welfare decisions completely ignores the structural forces like systemic poverty and historical disenfranchisement that funnel Native families into the child welfare system today.
And this debate over ICWA naturally raises a broader, intensely debated question across the entire adoption spectrum: the ethics of transracial adoption.
Yeah, this is a massive topic. What happens when children of color are placed in white homes? In 1972, the National Association of Black Social Workers, the NABSW, released an explosive policy statement.
What did they say?
They declared vehement opposition to placing black children in white homes, going so far as to call it cultural genocide.
Now, that language was intentionally incendiary. It was meant to grab the nation's attention, but their underlying reasoning was very precise and rooted in developmental psychology.
What was their core argument?
They argued that white adoptive families, no matter how well-intentioned or loving, were structurally incapable of preparing black children for life in a racist society.
Interesting.
They maintained that black children needed to learn specific survival skills, what they termed black pride or black identity, from black adults who actually had to navigate that racism firsthand every single day.
Let's reframe this for a moment to really understand the core of their argument for you as the listener, because it can be hard for adoptive parents to hear. It's not about accusing white adoptive parents of not loving their child. Obviously, they love their children fiercely. The question they were posing is whether love is a sufficient armor. Is love alone enough to protect a child against a society that will inevitably look at them and treat them as black?
Right. Can love alone equip a child with the tools they need when they walk out the front door and get pulled over by the police?
It is a profound question. The research that followed this debate highlighted the critical difference between a colorblind parenting approach and necessary racial socialization.
Many white adoptive parents naturally defaulted to colorblindness. They wanted to treat their child simply as their child, without focusing on race, believing that was the most egalitarian approach.
But the study showed this left the children completely unprepared.
It did. While well-intentioned, the colorblind approach often left children adrift during their first encounters with systemic racism or microaggressions.
They just didn't have the tools to process it.
Right, they didn't have the vocabulary or the framework. Many transracial adoptees reported growing up with a deep sense of cultural homelessness.
Meaning they felt they didn't fully belong in the white world they were intimately raised in, nor did they feel accepted in the black world they shared a physical racial identity with.
The political tide on this issue shifted dramatically in the 1990s. The crack cocaine epidemic, combined with aggressive policing policies, led to a massive surge of black children entering the foster care system, far outnumbering the available black adoptive families.
And the NABSW's stance had led many agencies to intentionally delay placements in order to find racial matches. Critics pointed out that this left kids lingering in foster care or institutions waiting for a perfect match.
So in 1994, Congress passed the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, or MeP.
Right. MeP and the amendments that followed essentially mandated race-neutral placements across the country. It explicitly prohibited any federally funded child welfare agency from using race, color, or national origin as a basis for denying or delaying placement decisions.
Proponents argued this from an individual rights perspective. Kids need homes immediately. White families are willing and vetted, and denying a child a loving home based on race is fundamentally wrong.
But critics argued from a community and developmental perspective. They argued that race isn't just an administrative checkbox you can ignore. It's a lived reality that shapes a child's entire existence, and ignoring it does a disservice to the child's future.
And crucially, if we're looking at the whole picture, we have to ask why there are so many black children in the system to begin with. Scholar Dorothy Roberts, in her landmark book Shattered Bonds, details how systemic bias functions in child welfare.
What does she point out?
She shows how the over-policing of black neighborhoods, higher rates of reporting by mandated reporters in public hospitals versus private clinics, and systemic poverty lead directly to black children being vastly disproportionately represented in child welfare.
It's a structural issue of poverty being conflated with neglect, not an issue of black families simply being less capable of care.
Exactly. You cannot resolve the transracial adoption debate without addressing the structural forces that funnel disproportionate numbers of black children into the system in the first place.
For decades, across all these eras we've discussed, the baby scoop era, the international booms, the foster care system, the institutions held all the cards.
They controlled everything.
They really did. They controlled all the paperwork, they amended the birth certificates, they managed the identities, and they kept the secrets. But then a massive disruption occurred. A technology that was originally meant for tracing ancient ancestry accidentally blew the entire sealed record system wide open.
Ah, the DNA revolution. Companies like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and GED Match hit the consumer market.
They were designed to give people fun ethnicity estimates or health risk reports.
But the underlying logic of genetic matching meant that if biological relatives submitted their DNA into the same database, the algorithms would inevitably connect them.
The irony here is just astounding. Adoptees managed to accomplish with a $90 spit tube ordered off the internet what decades of intense legal advocacy, protests, and legislative battles could not direct unfiltered access to their own origins.
The scale of this disruption is unprecedented. With these databases now holding tens of millions of profiles, almost any adoptee taking a test today will find at least second or third cousins, which is enough to reverse engineer a family tree and find biological parents.
But this revolution hasn't just been about joyful, tearful reunions on daytime television. It has systematically unearthed devastating institutional fraud.
Right. We are talking about baby scoop era mothers who were explicitly told by hospital staff in the 1960s that their babies had died at birth, suddenly taking a DNA test for fun and discovering that their children are alive and well, living in another state in their 50s.
That is mind-blowing.
We are talking about Guatemalan adoptees taking a test and discovering they have absolutely zero genetic relation to the people listed as their biological parents on their official government adoption documents.
Meaning they were swapped or stolen to fulfill a paperwork requirement.
Exactly. The psychological landscape of these discoveries is incredibly complex. The research into DNA reunions shows that reunion doesn't erase the underlying trauma of adoption, it transforms it.
An adoptee now has to integrate two entirely different histories, two completely different origin stories.
And discovering that your adoption was rooted in institutional deception or outright kidnapping adds a layer of profound psychological distress that many are navigating entirely alone.
It also brings up a massive, unprecedented ethical dilemma regarding consent. Taking a DNA test is a bilateral act with unilateral initiation.
Meaning what, exactly?
What I mean is, an adoptee takes a test, and by doing so, they suddenly uncover the identity of a birth parent who may have been legally promised total privacy 40 years ago by the state.
I see.
That birth parent might have built a whole new life, perhaps never telling their current spouse or their subsequent children about the surrender. The technology fundamentally invades that legally promised privacy.
It is a true ethical collision. The adoptee has a profound, undeniable human right to know their own medical and genetic history, to know who they are,
Of course.
but the birth parent also has a right to the privacy they were promised by a legal institution. There is currently no regulatory framework to manage the emotional fallout of this technology.
Pulling all these eras together. The coercion of the baby scoop era, the market forces of international adoption, the sovereignty battles of ICWA, the transracial debates, and the transparency forced by the DNA revolution, it reveals a central, inescapable contradiction in how America handles children without homes.
We have to look at the market problem and what experts call the foster care paradox.
The foster care paradox, tell us about that.
The numbers today are stark. There are roughly 370,000 children in the American foster care system at any given moment.
370,000.
Yes. Of those, about 100,000 are legally free and waiting for adoption right now. Yet, running parallel to this, we have a massive, highly lucrative private adoption industry fueled by adults spending tens of thousands of dollars to adopt.
This is the permanency paradox. How can we have 100,000 children waiting for homes and simultaneously have waiting lists of adults desperate to adopt?
Because it's a market mismatch. The private market is driven by the immense demand and financial resources of adults who specifically want healthy infants.
Infants.
Right. But the 100,000 children who actually need homes right now in the public system are generally older. They are sibling groups who need to stay together. They are teenagers. They are children carrying significant trauma or behavioral challenges.
Because they don't fit the market demand for infants, they often end up languishing in the system.
And the outcome for those kids is tragic. Many end up aging out of the system entirely at 18 or 21, transitioning into adulthood without any permanent family support.
This leads to devastatingly high rates of homelessness, early pregnancy, and justice system involvement. It shows that the overarching system is largely built around an adult's desire to acquire a specific type of child, rather than a system built around a child's need for a family.
However, there is a significant push for reform happening right now. Legislation like the Family First Prevention Services Act of 2018 represents a major shift in federal philosophy.
What does that act do?
It attempts to redirect federal child welfare resources away from foster care and adoption as a first resort, and instead heavily fund family preservation. It aims to provide mental health services, substance abuse treatment, and in-home parenting support to keep struggling families together before a removal ever becomes necessary.
Advocates are also pushing for better financial support for kinship care when grandparents or aunts step in to raise kids, and for making open adoption agreements legally enforceable nationwide so birth parents aren't permanently erased from a child's life.
It's a fundamental demand to rethink that 1851 standard of the best interests of the child. For over a century, that standard has suspiciously aligned with the interests, comforts, and market demands of adults who have social power and financial resources.
A better, more humane system would reckon honestly with this complex history. It would center the voices of the adoptees themselves and the birth families who are finally gaining the narrative authority to demand transparency and accountability.
It really is about shifting the power dynamics back to where they belong.
It leaves you with a really provocative thought to ponder long after we wrap up today. How might the very definition of family change in our society if we invested as much emotional and financial capital into keeping struggling families together as we currently invest in the legal transfer of children to new ones? What if the millions spent on private adoptions were redirected into community support networks?
It is a profound question that requires us to challenge our deepest cultural assumptions about who is deemed a worthy parent and what truly serves the long-term well-being of a child.
Before we go, from myself, Amy, and my co-host Sam, we must explicitly state that this entire conversation is derived from the first book of the 30-volume series, To Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America.
The book is titled Volume 1, America's Healthcare Crisis and Broken Public Institutions, authored by Sue B. Howell.
You can find this incredibly eye-opening book available right now in all Amazon bookstores across the world.
We enthusiastically encourage you to go check out the book for yourself, dive into the history, explore the nuances we touched on today, and please leave your comments and feedback.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Take care and keep questioning the narratives around you.